The summer of 1912 hung heavy over Salem, Massachusetts, like a wool blanket soaked in humidity and secrets. Thomas Whitmore adjusted his suspenders and wiped the sweat from his brow as he carefully positioned his father's new Kodak camera on the wooden tripod. At 19, he had developed a passion for photography that his father, Dr. Edmund Whitmore, encouraged as a gentleman's pursuit. "Margaret, hold still now," Thomas called to his 8-year-old sister, who was pushing herself lazily on the rope swing that hung from the ancient oak tree beside their Victorian home. The massive house loomed behind her, its dark shutters and ornate gingerbread trim casting intricate shadows across the manicured lawn. Margaret's golden curls caught the late afternoon sunlight as she turned toward her brother, her white pinafore dress pristine despite her play. "How long must I sit here, Tommy? It's frightfully boring." "Just another moment, dear sister. Father will want to see how well his investment in this camera has paid off." Thomas peered through the viewfinder, adjusting the focus ring. The Whitmore mansion filled the background perfectly, its 3 stories of weathered clapboard siding and wraparound porch creating an impressive backdrop for what he hoped would be a charming family photograph. The house had been in their family since 1847, built by their great-grandfather Jeremiah Whitmore, a successful textile merchant who had profited handsomely from Salem's maritime trade. Each generation had added their own touches to the imposing structure, but the basic Victorian Gothic architecture remained unchanged, with its pointed arch windows, decorative barge boards, and the peculiar tower room that jutted from the 3rd floor like a watchful eye. "They're perfect," Thomas murmured, pressing the shutter release. The mechanical click echoed in the still air, capturing what he believed would be a delightful portrait of his sister at play. Margaret immediately jumped from the swing, smoothing her dress. "May I go inside now? Cook promised to show me how to make her famous apple tarts." "Of course. Run along." Thomas began dismantling the camera equipment, carefully storing each piece in its designated compartment within the leather carrying case. Their father had impressed upon him the importance of maintaining the delicate mechanisms, and Thomas took great pride in his methodical approach to the craft. As evening approached, Thomas made his way to the cellar where he had converted a small room into a makeshift darkroom. The red-tinted oil lamp cast eerie shadows on the stone walls as he prepared the developing chemicals. The sharp smell of the solutions mixed with the musty odor of the old basement, creating an atmosphere that always made him slightly uneasy. Working with practiced precision, Thomas immersed the glass plate negative in the developer solution. Slowly, the image began to emerge, first as ghostly outlines, then with increasing clarity and detail. Margaret appeared first, her sweet face turned toward the camera, one hand gripping the rope of the swing. But as the image continued to develop, Thomas noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the background, clearly visible through the lace curtains of the 3rd-floor tower room window, was the unmistakable silhouette of a figure. A woman, he thought, with long hair, and what appeared to be a high-necked dress from a bygone era. Thomas blinked hard and leaned closer to the developing tray. The figure was undeniably there, standing perfectly still behind the curtains, appearing to gaze down at Margaret with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. His hands trembling slightly, Thomas completed the developing process and hung the photograph to dry. The tower room had been sealed shut for as long as he could remember. His father had told him it was due to structural concerns, but now Thomas wondered if there was another reason entirely. The next morning would bring questions that would shake the very foundation of everything Thomas thought he knew about his family's ancestral home. Thomas barely slept that night. The image of the mysterious figure haunted his dreams, and he found himself staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar creaks and groans of the old Victorian house. Every settling beam, every whisper of wind through the eaves seemed to carry a message he couldn't quite decipher. As dawn broke over Salem, casting long shadows across Chestnut Street, Thomas made his decision. He dressed quickly in his wool trousers and white cotton shirt, then crept down the servants' staircase to avoid waking his family. The photograph, now fully dry, lay on the kitchen table where he had left it the night before. In the morning light streaming through the kitchen windows, the image seemed even more disturbing. The figure in the tower room window was clearly defined, unmistakably human in shape, yet somehow ethereal in its presence. Thomas studied every detail through his father's magnifying glass, noting the old-fashioned dress and the way the figure's posture suggested someone keeping vigil. "Master Thomas, you're up early this morning," came the cheerful voice of Mrs. Hartwell, the family's cook and housekeeper. She had been with the Whitmores for nearly 15 years, arriving shortly after Margaret's birth when their mother had taken ill. "Mrs. Hartwell," Thomas said, carefully sliding the photograph toward her. "Have you ever known anyone to be in the tower room?" The elderly woman's flour-dusted hands froze as she looked at the image. Her face, normally ruddy and warm, drained of color. She set down her mixing bowl with trembling fingers and crossed herself quickly. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," she whispered, her Irish accent thickening with emotion. "Where did you get this photograph?" "I took it yesterday afternoon when Margaret was playing on the swing." "Mrs. Hartwell, who is that in the window?" The housekeeper glanced nervously toward the doorway, then leaned closer to Thomas. "Master Thomas, that room has been sealed since before I came to work for your family. Your father gave me strict instructions never to speak of it, but—" She paused, wringing her apron in her hands. "The servants who worked here before me, they used to whisper stories." "What kind of stories?" "About Miss Eleanor, your father's aunt. She lived in that tower room when she was just a girl, about your sister's age. The story goes that she fell ill with a fever in the winter of 1875 and—" Mrs. Hartwell's voice trailed off as footsteps echoed in the hallway above. "And what happened to her?" Thomas pressed. "She disappeared, Master Thomas. One morning the room was empty. The window was standing wide open despite the December cold, and Miss Eleanor was never seen again. Some say she threw herself from that window in her delirium. Others claim she simply vanished into thin air." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine as he absorbed this information. "But surely someone would have found a body if she had fallen." "That's just it, Mrs. Hartwell whispered. "They searched everywhere. The ground beneath the window, the surrounding woods, even dragged Miller's Pond. Nothing. It was as if she had never existed at all, except for the portrait hanging in your father's study." The sound of Margaret's laughter drifted down from upstairs, followed by the familiar voice of their governess, Miss Patterson. Thomas quickly slipped the photograph into his vest pocket as his father's heavy footsteps descended the main staircase. "Mrs. Hartwell," Thomas said urgently, "where is the key to the tower room?" The housekeeper shook her head vigorously. "Your father has it, and he's made it clear that room is never to be opened. But Master Thomas," she grabbed his sleeve as he turned to leave, "if that's truly Miss Eleanor in your photograph, perhaps it's best to leave well enough alone. Some doors are sealed for good reason." Dr. Edmund Whitmore entered the kitchen, adjusting his gold pocket watch. "Good morning, Thomas. You're up early today." "Good morning, Father. I was hoping to discuss something with you." Thomas's hand instinctively moved to the photograph in his pocket. "Walk with me to the hospital, then. I have surgery scheduled at 8 o'clock. Dr. Whitmore picked up his medical bag and headed toward the door. "Mrs. Hartwell, please ensure Margaret practices her piano lessons this afternoon." As they walked down the tree-lined street toward Salem Hospital, Thomas struggled with how to broach the subject of the photograph and the sealed tower room. The morning air was crisp despite the summer season, and the familiar sights of their neighborhood seemed somehow different, as if he was seeing them through a veil of newly discovered mystery. The walk to Salem Hospital took them past the old Chestnut Street Cemetery, where weathered headstones stood like silent sentinels among the ancient oak trees. Thomas had walked this route countless times with his father, but today the familiar path seemed charged with unspoken secrets. "Father," Thomas began carefully, "I've been thinking about our family history lately, about the relatives who lived in our house before us." "Doctor." Whitmore's stride slowed slightly, and Thomas noticed his father's knuckles whiten as he gripped his medical bag more tightly. "What specifically has sparked this interest, son?" Thomas withdrew the photograph from his vest pocket, his heart pounding as he handed it to his father. "I took this yesterday afternoon. I developed it last night in the basement darkroom." Dr. Whitmore stopped walking entirely. His face went pale as he studied the image, his professional composure cracking for just a moment before he regained control. When he looked up at Thomas, there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a mixture of fear and profound sadness. "Where exactly did you develop this photograph?" "In the basement, Father, as always. But that's not what concerns me. Look at the tower room window." "I see it." Dr. Whitmore's voice was barely above a whisper. He folded the photograph carefully and slipped it into his own coat pocket. "Thomas, there are things about our family, about that house, that I had hoped to spare you from knowing." They resumed walking, but at a much slower pace. The morning bustle of Salem, horse-drawn carriages, early shopkeepers opening their establishments, children walking to school, seemed to fade into the background as Dr. Whitmore gathered his thoughts. "Eleanor was my father's sister," he began. "She was 8 years old when she came to live with us in 1875. Her parents, my grandparents, had died in a typhoid outbreak in Boston, and she was the only survivor. Thomas listened intently, noting how his father's medical training couldn't quite mask the emotion in his voice. She was a delicate child, prone to fevers and what we would now call episodes of delirium. The tower room became her sanctuary. She claimed she could see everything from up there, the harbor, the town, even ships approaching from the Atlantic. But as winter approached, her condition worsened. Dr. Whitmore paused as they reached the hospital steps. Several colleagues nodded their greetings, but he barely acknowledged them. The night she disappeared, there was a terrible storm. Ice had formed on the windows, and the wind was howling like something out of Dante's Inferno. I was only 12 years old then, but I remember my father checking on Eleanor multiple times throughout the evening. She had been running a high fever for 3 days. What happened that night, Father? Around midnight, we heard her calling out from the tower room, not screaming in distress, but calling as if she was greeting someone. My father and I rushed upstairs, but when we reached the door, Dr. Whitmore's voice faltered. The room was empty. The window was open and snow was blowing in, but Eleanor was nowhere to be found. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. But surely someone as ill as you describe couldn't have climbed out a third-floor window. That's what we thought. That's what we told the police, the neighbors, everyone who asked. But Thomas, Dr. Whitmore turned to face his son directly. What we found in that room defied all logic. Eleanor's nightgown was folded neatly on the bed, as if she had undressed for sleep. Her slippers were placed side by side on the floor, and on the windowsill, written in what appeared to be frost, were the words, "I must go to them." To them? Who was she referring to? Dr. Whitmore shook his head. We never knew. My father sealed that room the very next day and forbade anyone from ever entering it again. He said some mysteries were too dangerous to solve. As they stood on the hospital steps, Thomas processed this information. The photograph in his father's pocket suddenly felt like evidence of something far more complex than a simple family tragedy. Father, do you believe Eleanor is still in that house? Dr. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, watching as a horse-drawn ambulance arrived with a patient. I believe, Thomas, that some souls become so attached to a place, to the people they love, that death itself cannot sever that connection. Whether that's Eleanor in your photograph, I cannot say with certainty. But I can tell you that Margaret bears an uncanny resemblance to her great-aunt at that same age. Thomas spent the remainder of the morning in a state of distracted contemplation. His father's revelation had opened a door to questions that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. As he walked home from the hospital, the familiar streets of Salem felt different somehow, as if the very air carried whispers of the past. The Whitmore house stood majestically on its tree-lined lot, its Victorian architecture more imposing than ever in the midday sun. Thomas paused at the front gate, his eyes drawn inevitably to the tower room window. The lace curtains hung motionless behind the glass, revealing nothing of what might lie beyond. "Tommy!" Margaret's voice called from the front porch, where she sat with her governess, Miss Patterson, working on her embroidery. "Did you bring me anything from town?" "Not today, little one," Thomas replied, forcing a smile as he climbed the porch steps. "But perhaps we can walk to Peterson's confectionery later this afternoon." Miss Patterson, a stern woman in her 40s who had come highly recommended from Boston, looked up from her needlework. "Master Thomas, your sister has been asking the most peculiar questions this morning." "What kind of questions?" Margaret set down her embroidery hoop and looked up at her brother with bright, curious eyes. "I wanted to know about the lady who watches me when I play outside. Miss Patterson says there's no such person, but I've seen her many times." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. "What lady, Margaret?" "The one in the tower window. She has lovely long hair and always wears a white dress. Sometimes she waves at me, but she looks terribly sad." Margaret's innocent description sent chills down Thomas's spine. Miss Patterson frowned. "I've told Miss Margaret repeatedly that she's allowing her imagination to run wild. The tower room has been sealed for years." "Where exactly do you see this lady?" Thomas asked, kneeling down to Margaret's eye level. "Usually when I'm on the swing or playing with my dolls under the oak tree. She stands very still behind the curtains, like she's watching over me. Mother used to do the same thing when I played in the garden, before she went to heaven." Thomas exchanged a meaningful glance with Miss Patterson, whose skeptical expression was beginning to show cracks of uncertainty. "Margaret, would you like to help me with something in Father's study?" Thomas asked. The study was Dr. Whitmore's sanctuary, lined floor to ceiling with medical texts, family photographs, and various artifacts from their ancestors. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and leather, with hints of the carbolic acid that constantly clung to his father's clothing. Thomas led Margaret to the far wall, where a collection of family portraits hung in ornate frames. Among them was a painting he had seen countless times, but never truly examined closely. It depicted a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, with golden curls and wearing a white pinafore dress remarkably similar to the one Margaret favored. "Margaret, what do you think of this portrait?" His sister studied the painting with the serious concentration that children reserve for things that truly capture their interest. After a moment, her eyes widened with recognition. "Tommy, she looks just like me, but her dress is a bit different, and her hair ribbon is blue instead of pink." Thomas read the small brass nameplate affixed to the frame. "Eleanor Whitmore, 1875. This is our great-aunt Eleanor, Margaret. She lived in our house when she was exactly your age." Margaret traced the air in front of the portrait, as if trying to touch the painted face. "Is she the lady in the tower window?" Before Thomas could answer, a cold draught swept through the study despite the closed windows and doors. The heavy velvet curtains stirred slightly, and both children turned toward the sound of footsteps in the hallway above their heads. "That's strange," Margaret whispered. "Everyone else is downstairs." Thomas listened intently. The footsteps were light, like those of a child or a small woman, and they seemed to be moving back and forth across the floor directly above the study. The sound was rhythmic, almost pacing, as if someone was walking restlessly from window to window. "Miss Patterson and Mrs. Hartwell are both in the kitchen," Thomas murmured, "and Father won't be home until evening." The footsteps stopped abruptly, followed by a silence so complete it seemed to press against their eardrums. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, came the faint sound of a music box playing a melancholy waltz. Margaret grabbed Thomas's hand. "That's coming from upstairs, from the direction of the tower room." Thomas felt the familiar chill that had been plaguing him since he developed the photograph. The music was beautiful but haunting, played on what sounded like an antique music box with slightly worn mechanisms that gave the melody a ghostly, ethereal quality. "Tommy," Margaret said softly, "I think she wants us to know she's there." The haunting melody continued to drift through the house, each note carrying an otherworldly sadness that seemed to seep into the very walls. Thomas stood frozen in the study, his hand still clasped in Margaret's small fingers, as they both listened to the impossible music coming from the sealed tower room. "We should tell Miss Patterson," Thomas whispered, though something deep inside him resisted the idea of involving anyone else in what was becoming an intensely personal family mystery. "No," Margaret said with surprising firmness. "She'll just say it's our imagination again. Besides, the music is beautiful. It doesn't frighten me." Thomas marveled at his sister's composure. Where he felt anxiety and unease, she seemed to experience only curiosity and a strange sense of comfort. Perhaps children were more naturally attuned to the supernatural, or perhaps Margaret's innocent nature allowed her to sense Eleanor's protective intentions. "Come," Thomas said, making a decision that surprised even himself. "Let's go upstairs." They crept up the main staircase, their footsteps muffled by the thick Persian runner that had been in the family for decades. The music grew clearer as they ascended, and Thomas could identify the melody as Chopin's Minute Waltz, though played at a much slower, more melancholic tempo. On the second-floor landing, they paused outside their parents' former bedroom, now kept as a memorial to their mother, who had died when Margaret was only 3. The music seemed to be coming from directly above this room, which would place it precisely in the tower. "The servants' staircase," Thomas murmured, remembering the narrow stairs that led from the kitchen to the 3rd floor, primarily used by the household staff. "We can get closer to the tower room that way." They made their way to the back of the house, where the cramped servants' staircase wound upward in a tight spiral. The steps creaked under their weight, each sound seeming unnaturally loud in the stillness. As they climbed, the music box melody became more distinct, accompanied now by what sounded like soft humming in a child's voice. The 3rd-floor hallway was dimmer than the rest of the house, lit only by a small window at the far end. The tower room door stood at the end of the corridor, its dark wood surface unmarked by any handle or keyhole visible from this side. Dr. Whitmore had indeed sealed it thoroughly, but now standing just feet away from the mysterious room, Thomas could hear more than just the music box. There was definitely someone humming along with the melody, and occasionally what sounded like the soft rustling of fabric, as if someone in a long dress was moving about the room. Margaret stepped closer to the door and pressed her ear against the wood. "Eleanor?" she called softly. "Are you in there?" The music stopped instantly. The sudden silence was more startling than any loud noise could have been. Thomas held his breath, waiting for some response, some sign of what lay beyond that sealed door. Then, So quietly he might have imagined it, came a gentle knocking from inside the room. 3 soft taps, followed by a pause, then 3 more taps. It was the kind of knocking a child might make when playing a game of hide-and-seek. Margaret smiled and knocked back on the door in the same pattern. The response was immediate. 3 taps, pause, 3 more taps, but this time followed by what sounded unmistakably like a child's delighted laughter. "She's playing with me," Margaret whispered to Thomas, her eyes bright with wonder. Thomas felt torn between protective concern for his sister and a growing fascination with the phenomenon they were witnessing. The presence behind the door seemed gentle, even playful, but he couldn't shake the memory of Eleanor's mysterious disappearance and his father's warning about doors sealed for good reason. "Margaret, we should go back downstairs," he said reluctantly. But as they turned to leave, they heard the music box begin to play again, this time a different melody. Thomas recognized it as a lullaby their mother used to sing, a sweet, simple tune that had comforted both children through countless bedtimes. Margaret stopped walking and turned back toward the door with tears in her eyes. "Tommy, that's Mama's song. How does she know Mama's song?" Thomas felt his throat constrict with emotion. The melody was indeed their mother's favorite lullaby, one she had sung exclusively to her children. There was no way anyone else could have known it, unless— "Perhaps Eleanor has been watching over our family longer than we realized," Thomas said softly. As they stood in the hallway, listening to the ghostly rendition of their mother's lullaby, Thomas began to understand that Eleanor's presence might not be something to fear, but rather something to cherish. She seemed to be reaching out to them across the decades, offering comfort and connection in the only way a spirit could. That evening, Dr. Whitmore returned from the hospital to find Thomas waiting for him in his study. The photograph lay on the mahogany desk between them, along with a leather-bound journal that Thomas had discovered hidden behind the medical texts. "I found this while looking for more information about Eleanor," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "It appears to be grandfather's diary from 1875. Dr. Whitmore's face paled as he recognized his father's distinctive handwriting on the journal's cover. "Thomas, where exactly did you find this?" "Behind your medical textbooks, Father. It was tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of Gray's Anatomy." Thomas opened the journal to a page he had marked with a ribbon. "Listen to this entry from December 15, 1875. Eleanor's condition worsens with each passing day. She speaks constantly of voices calling to her, of people she claims to see in her room. Mrs. Whitmore believes the child is merely delirious from fever, but I have begun to suspect something far more extraordinary." Dr. Whitmore sank into his chair, suddenly looking much older than his 52 years. "Continue reading, son." Thomas turned the page carefully. "December 18th, 1875. Last night I witnessed something that defies all medical explanation. Eleanor was standing at her window, apparently conversing with someone outside, though when I looked I saw only empty air. When I questioned her about it, she told me her parents had come to visit her, that they were waiting for her to join them. The child showed no signs of fever at that moment, and her eyes were clear and lucid." "Father knew," Dr. Whitmore murmured. "He knew there was something supernatural about Eleanor's condition." "There's more," Thomas said, turning to the final entries. "December 20th, 1875. Eleanor has asked me to promise that if anything happens to her, I will ensure she can remain near the children who will come after her. She says she understands now that some people are meant to be guardians even after death. I have given her my word, though I pray it will not be necessary." Dr. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photograph of Margaret on the swing, with Eleanor's ghostly figure visible in the window above. "Your grandfather was a man of science, Thomas, but he was also wise enough to recognize that science cannot explain everything. Father, I believe Eleanor is still in that tower room, and I believe she's been watching over Margaret." Thomas leaned forward earnestly. "Margaret has been seeing her for months, perhaps longer. Today we heard music playing from the sealed room, and Eleanor seemed to respond when Margaret spoke to her. Instead of the alarm Thomas expected, Dr. Whitmore nodded slowly. "I've suspected as much for some time. There have been incidents. Nights when I've heard footsteps in the hallway above, music playing when no one is awake, and Margaret often speaks to someone when she thinks no one is listening." "Then why keep the room sealed, Doctor?" Whitmore rose and walked to the window overlooking the garden, where Margaret's swing hung motionless in the evening breeze. "Because I was afraid, Thomas, afraid of what we might find, afraid of disturbing something that seemed content to remain hidden. But perhaps," he turned back to his son, "perhaps it's time." "Time for what?" to honor the promise my father made. Dr. Whitmore walked to a small painting on the wall and carefully removed it, revealing a hidden safe. After turning the combination, he withdrew a small brass key. This opens the tower room. My father gave it to me on his deathbed, along with instructions that I should use it only when I was certain Eleanor needed to be freed from her vigil. Thomas stared at the key, feeling the weight of generations of family secrets. You think she needs to be freed? I think, my boy, that Eleanor has been waiting 37 years for someone to acknowledge her presence and her purpose. Your photograph may be her way of telling us that the time has come. As if summoned by their conversation, the faint sound of the music box drifted down from the tower room, playing once again the lullaby that had belonged to their mother. But this time, Thomas heard something different in the melody, a note of anticipation rather than melancholy. Margaret should be with us, Thomas said suddenly. If Eleanor has been watching over her specifically, then Margaret deserves to be part of this. Dr. Whitmore considered this, then nodded. Tomorrow morning, after breakfast, we'll open the room together, as a family. He held up the brass key, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. Eleanor has waited this long. One more night won't matter. But as they spoke, neither man noticed the gentle glow that had begun to emanate from beneath the door of the sealed tower room, or the way the lace curtains in that window moved slightly, as if stirred by an unseen hand, preparing for a long-awaited reunion. The next morning dawned grey and misty, with fog rolling in from Salem harbor and settling over the town like a shroud. Thomas had barely slept, his mind racing with anticipation and apprehension about what they might discover behind the sealed door. Margaret sat at the breakfast table, picking at her porridge, while humming the same lullaby they had heard from the tower room. She seemed unusually quiet, almost expectant, as if she too sensed that this day would bring revelations. "Margaret, Doctor," Whitmore said gently, setting down his coffee cup. "Your brother and I have something important to discuss with you." She looked up with those bright, knowing eyes that sometimes seemed far too old for her 8 years. "It's about Eleanor, isn't it? She told me in my dreams last night that today would be special." Thomas and his father exchanged glances. The supernatural connection between Margaret and Eleanor was apparently even stronger than they had realized. "What did she tell you in your dream?" Thomas asked. Margaret tilted her head thoughtfully. "She said she's been very lonely, but that she's happy because she got to watch over me like she promised. She said she's not sad anymore because soon we'll be able to talk properly, not just through the door." Dr. Whitmore withdrew the brass key from his vest pocket and placed it on the table. "Margaret, we're going to open Eleanor's room this morning. Are you certain you want to be there when we do?" "Oh, yes," Margaret said without hesitation. "She's been waiting for so long." An hour later, the three Whitmores stood before the sealed door on the 3rd floor. Mrs. Hartwell had crossed herself multiple times and retreated to the kitchen muttering prayers in Irish Gaelic. Miss Patterson had taken the day off to visit her sister in Boston, claiming she felt a migraine coming on. Thomas noticed that the hallway seemed brighter than usual, despite the overcast sky outside. A warm, golden light seemed to emanate from beneath the door, growing stronger as they approached. "Are we all ready?" Dr. Whitmore asked, holding the key steady despite the slight tremor in his hands. Margaret stepped forward and placed her small hand on the door. "Eleanor, we're here. We're going to open the door now." From inside the room came a soft sound, like a sigh of relief, followed by 3 gentle taps on the door, Eleanor's familiar signal. Dr. Whitmore inserted the key into a hidden lock that became visible only when the key approached it. The mechanism turned smoothly, as if it had been oiled yesterday rather than sealed for 37 years. The door swung open on silent hinges, and they stepped into a room that defied everything Thomas had expected. The tower room was exactly as it must have been in 1875. Sunlight streamed through spotless windows, illuminating furniture covered in white linen, a child's bed with a patchwork quilt, and toys arranged neatly on shelves as if waiting for their owner's return. The air smelled of lavender and rosewater, fresh and clean despite the decades of closure. But most remarkably, standing by the window overlooking the garden, was Eleanor herself. She appeared exactly as she did in the family portrait, a translucent figure of a young girl with golden curls and a white pinafore dress. But unlike the solid, frightening spectre Thomas might have imagined, Eleanor seemed to glow with a gentle, warm light that made the room feel safe and welcoming. "Eleanor," Margaret whispered, stepping forward without fear. The spirit turned toward them, and Thomas saw that her face was radiant with joy. She held out her arms to Margaret, who walked directly to her great-aunt without hesitation. When Margaret reached Eleanor, the ghostly figure became more solid, more real, until she appeared almost as corporeal as any living person. "Hello, dear Margaret," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the same musical quality as the lullabies they had heard. "I've been waiting so long to speak with you properly." Dr. Whitmore stood transfixed, watching his daughter embrace the spirit of his long-lost aunt. "Eleanor, forgive us for sealing you away. We didn't understand." Eleanor smiled, still holding Margaret close. "There was nothing to forgive, Uncle Edmund. I chose to remain. Someone needed to watch over the children to keep the family safe. It was my purpose, my gift to those I love." Thomas found his voice at last. "Eleanor, in the photograph I took, you were watching Margaret. How long have you been protecting her?" "Since the day she was born," Eleanor replied simply. "I was with your mother during her illness, comforting her in her final days. I promised her I would watch over Margaret always." The room filled with an ethereal light as Eleanor moved to a small music box on the windowsill, the same one they had been hearing throughout the house. "This was mine when I lived," she said, winding the delicate mechanism. "But music is even more beautiful when you can share it." As the familiar waltz began to play, Eleanor took Margaret's hands and began to teach her to dance, their feet barely touching the floor as they moved in perfect harmony around the preserved room. As Margaret and Eleanor danced to the music box melody, Thomas settled into a small chair by the window, still marveling at the impossible scene before him. The tower room felt more like a sanctuary than a tomb, filled with an otherworldly peace that seemed to embrace them all. "Eleanor," Dr. Whitmore said gently, "what happened that night in 1875? How did you transition?" Eleanor guided Margaret to the window seat and sat beside her, her form becoming more solid and detailed as she spoke. "The fever wasn't what the doctors thought, Uncle Edmund. I was dying, yes, but not from illness. I was being called to the other side by my parents, who had been waiting for me since the typhoid took them." She gazed out the window at the garden below, where the swing hung motionless in the still air. "I could see them clearly, standing just beyond the oak tree, reaching out their hands to me. The pull to join them was so strong, like a current in the ocean drawing me toward shore." "But you didn't go," Thomas observed. "I almost did," Eleanor admitted. "I was so tired, so ready to be with them again, but as I prepared to leave I felt something else, something stronger than even the call of my parents." She turned to Margaret with infinite tenderness. "I felt the future generations of our family, the children who would need protection, the love that would need nurturing." Margaret took Eleanor's translucent hand in her own small fingers. "You stayed for us. I stayed because I understood that love doesn't end with death, dear one. Sometimes it transforms into something greater, something eternal." Eleanor's voice carried the wisdom of decades spent in the space between worlds. "When I made my choice that night, I felt a great peace settle over me. My parents understood, and they told me they would wait for me as long as necessary." Dr. Whitmore sat on the edge of the bed, his medical skepticism completely abandoned in the face of this miraculous reunion. "All these years, we thought you had suffered a tragic fate." "Oh, but I didn't suffer, Uncle. I chose my fate, and it was the most beautiful choice I've ever made." Eleanor stood and moved to a small writing desk by the wall. "I've kept a record of everything, you know. Every birth, every first word, every milestone of the family I've protected." She opened a drawer that shouldn't have contained anything after 37 years of abandonment, yet withdrew a leather journal filled with entries written in a delicate feminine hand. The pages looked fresh, as if the words had been penned yesterday. "I was there when your father took his first steps, Edmund. I was there when he graduated from medical school, when he married your mother, when Thomas was born." Eleanor's eyes sparkled with remembered joy. "And I was there the night Margaret came into this world, during that terrible storm when your mother nearly didn't survive the birth." Thomas leaned forward intently. "You helped save them?" "I guided the midwife's hands when she faltered, whispered comfort to your mother when the pain became unbearable, and held vigil all through that long night." Eleanor turned to Dr. Whitmore. "Do you remember how the storm suddenly calmed, just as Margaret drew her first breath?" Dr. Whitmore's eyes widened with recognition. "I always wondered about that. The wind died completely, the rain stopped, and there was this sudden, inexplicable warmth in the room. That was me welcoming Margaret into the world and promising her mother that this precious child would never be alone." Eleanor returned to Margaret's side. "Your mother could see me in those final days before she passed. We spoke often about how I would continue to watch over you." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of wonder rather than sadness. "Mama knew about you. She knew, and she was comforted by the knowledge that you would have a guardian angel who understood what it meant to be a little girl in this big, sometimes frightening world. Eleanor wiped away Margaret's tears with ghostly fingers that somehow felt warm and real. Every time you felt safe playing alone in the garden, every time you felt brave enough to explore the house, every time you slept peacefully through a thunderstorm, I was there, surrounding you with protection. Thomas thought of all the times Margaret had seemed unnaturally calm in situations that should have frightened a child, all the near accidents that had been mysteriously avoided, all the nights she had slept soundly while storms raged outside. "The photograph," Thomas said suddenly. "You wanted us to see you, didn't you?" Eleanor smiled. "I've been trying for months to make my presence known to you and your father. Margaret has always been able to see me, but I needed the adults to understand as well." She moved to the window and gestured toward the swing. "That day when you took the photograph, I made myself visible in the most obvious way I could, hoping it would finally open the door to this conversation." As the afternoon light filtered through the tower room windows, casting rainbow patterns through the old glass, Eleanor continued to share the story of her decades-long vigil, revealing herself, not as a tragic ghost, but as the family's most devoted protector. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, Eleanor led them to discover more secrets hidden within the tower room. Behind a loose floorboard, she revealed a collection of items that told the story of the Whitmore family's supernatural heritage. "Our family has always been different," Eleanor explained, carefully lifting out a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. "These are correspondence between your great-grandmother and a spiritualist in Boston. The ability to see and communicate with spirits runs in our bloodline, particularly among the women." Dr. Whitmore examined the letters with fascination. "Mother never mentioned anything about this. She was frightened by her gift," Eleanor said sadly. "After I disappeared, she convinced herself that acknowledging the supernatural had somehow caused my fate. She made your father promise never to speak of such things, hoping to protect future generations from what she saw as a curse." Margaret looked up from where she was examining a small collection of crystals and peculiar stones. "But it's not a curse, is it, Eleanor? It's a gift." "Very wise, dear one. It is indeed a gift, though one that comes with great responsibility." Eleanor moved to another hidden compartment and withdrew what appeared to be a family tree, but unlike any Thomas had ever seen. Alongside each name and date were small notations in various hands describing supernatural encounters and abilities. "Your great-great-grandmother could predict deaths 3 days before they occurred," Eleanor said, pointing to an entry from 1823. "Your great-uncle William could see the spirits of those who had died violently, which is why he became such a successful detective in Boston." Thomas studied the family tree with growing amazement. "And our mother? Your mother could sense illness before any symptoms appeared. It's how she met your father, actually. She approached him at a town social and told him he needed to examine his heart, that she sensed something wrong. The examination revealed a minor defect that could have been fatal if left untreated." Dr. Whitmore sat down heavily in a chair, overwhelmed by these revelations. "She never told me she had seen anything supernatural. She said she had simply noticed I looked pale. She loved you too much to burden you with the truth of her abilities, but she used her gift quietly throughout her life, guiding people to doctors when she sensed illness, warning neighbors about dangers they couldn't perceive." Eleanor's expression grew tender, and she passed that gift to Margaret. All eyes turned to the 8-year-old, who was now holding what appeared to be a mirror with an ornate silver frame. In its surface, instead of her own reflection, swirling mists moved like captured clouds. "Margaret has the strongest gift of any Whitmore in 4 generations," Eleanor continued. "She can not only see spirits, but communicate across the veil between worlds. That's why I've been able to interact with her so clearly." Margaret looked up from the mirror. "Is that why I sometimes know things before they happen, like when Mrs. Patterson was going to fall on the stairs last week, and I warned her to hold the banister tighter?" "Exactly, dear one. Your intuition is actually your ability to perceive events before they unfold in our physical world." Thomas felt a mixture of wonder and concern. "Eleanor, if Margaret has such powerful abilities, shouldn't we be worried about her safety? About her disappearing as you did?" Eleanor shook her head firmly. "Margaret's situation is entirely different from mine. I was already dying when I made my choice. Margaret is healthy, loved and grounded in this world by strong family bonds." She knelt beside Margaret and looked directly into her eyes. "But you will need guidance, sweet child. Your gifts will grow stronger as you mature, and without proper understanding they could become overwhelming." "Will you teach me?" Margaret asked eagerly. For as long as I am able, but eventually you'll need to find others like yourself, people who can help you develop your abilities safely." Eleanor turned to Dr. Whitmore and Thomas. "There's a woman in Boston, Mrs. Catherine Whitfield, who runs a discreet salon for people with supernatural gifts. She was a friend of your great-grandmother's." Dr. Whitmore nodded slowly, his scientific mind struggling to process these revelations while his paternal instincts focused on protecting his daughter. "You're suggesting we should embrace these abilities rather than suppress them?" "I'm suggesting that denying your family's true nature has caused more harm than good. Look what happened when the truth was hidden from me, when I had no guidance or understanding of what was happening to me." Eleanor gestured around the preserved room. "I made my choice in isolation and confusion. Margaret deserves better." As if to emphasize Eleanor's point, the mirror in Margaret's hands suddenly cleared, showing not mists, but a clear image of their mother, smiling and reaching toward the glass as if trying to touch her daughter's face. Margaret gasped with joy. "Mama, oh Mama, I've missed you so much." The image lasted only a moment before fading back to ordinary reflection, but the impact on the family was profound. Dr. Whitmore's eyes filled with tears, and Thomas felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced since their mother's death. "She wanted you to know she's at peace," Eleanor said gently, "and that she's proud of the brave, gifted daughter she left behind." As evening approached, Eleanor's form began to shimmer more noticeably, becoming slightly more translucent as the natural light faded from the tower room. She moved to light an oil lamp on the desk, her ghostly fingers somehow able to manipulate the physical world when needed. "There's something important we must discuss," Eleanor said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Now that the truth has been revealed, now that Margaret's gifts are awakening more fully, I face a choice I've been avoiding for 37 years. Dr. Whitmore leaned forward in his chair. "What kind of choice?" Eleanor sat on the window seat, gazing out at the garden where twilight shadows were beginning to gather. "My parents are still waiting for me, just beyond the veil. They've been patient, loving, understanding of my mission here. But they've also been alone all this time, separated from their child by my decision to remain." Margaret, who had been quietly examining the spiritual artifacts, looked up with sudden alarm. "You're not leaving, are you, Eleanor?" "That's what I must decide, dear one. My original purpose was to protect the children of this family until they were old enough to protect themselves. You're growing stronger every day, developing the gifts that will keep you safe. And now your father and Thomas understand the truth about our family's abilities." Thomas felt a surprising pang of loss at the thought of Eleanor leaving. In just one day, she had become as real and important to him as any living relative. "But Eleanor, this house, this family, we're your home too." Eleanor smiled with infinite tenderness. "You are my heart, all of you. But I've learned that love sometimes means knowing when to let go." She stood and walked to the small writing desk, withdrawing one final item from a hidden drawer, a key identical to the one Dr. Whitmore had used to open the room. "This key will allow you to seal this room again, should you choose to, or—" She held out the key to Margaret. "It can remain open, a bridge between worlds for those in our family who need to cross over temporarily." Margaret took the key, its brass surface warm against her palm, despite Eleanor's ghostly touch. "What do you want to do, Eleanor? What would make you happiest?" "I want to be with my parents again," Eleanor admitted, her voice soft but certain. "I want to walk with them in the gardens of eternity, to feel their embrace after so many years of separation. But I also want to know that you'll be safe, that our family's gifts will be nurtured rather than feared." Dr. Whitmore rose and approached Eleanor, no longer intimidated by her supernatural presence. "Eleanor, you've given our family 37 years of protection and love. If it's time for you to go, then go with our blessing and our eternal gratitude. But," Thomas added, "we'll never forget you. Your story will be passed down to future generations, not as a ghost tale, but as a family legacy of love and sacrifice." Eleanor's form began to glow more brightly, and through the window, they could see two figures materializing in the garden below, a man and woman in clothing from the 1870s, their faces radiant with joy and anticipation. "They're beautiful," Margaret whispered, pressing her face to the window glass. "They've been waiting so long," Eleanor said, her voice filled with emotion. "But before I go, there's one last gift I want to give you, Margaret." Eleanor approached the child and placed her translucent hands on Margaret's temples. Immediately, Margaret's eyes widened with wonder, and she began to describe visions that flickered through her mind like pages in a book. "I can see so much," Margaret breathed. "I can see how to use the mirror to speak with spirits who need help crossing over. I can see how to sense danger before it arrives. I can see how to use my gifts to heal people's hearts when they're grieving." She looked up at Eleanor with tears of gratitude. "You're giving me all your knowledge. Everything I've learned during my time between worlds is now yours," Eleanor confirmed. "Use it wisely, use it with love, and never be afraid of who you truly are." The figures in the garden began to move closer to the house, and Eleanor's parents looked up at the tower room window with expressions of infinite patience and love. They had waited nearly 4 decades for this moment, and they would wait as long as necessary for their daughter to say her goodbyes. "Will we ever see you again?" Thomas asked. Eleanor smiled, her form becoming more ethereal as her parents' presence grew stronger. "Love never truly dies, Thomas. It only changes form. When you need me most, I'll find a way to let you know I'm still watching over you all." Margaret stepped forward and, in a gesture that surprised everyone, embraced Eleanor one final time. For a moment, both figures glowed with the same soft golden light, 2 souls connected across the boundary between life and death. "Thank you for staying with us," Margaret whispered. "Thank you for keeping me safe." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, "for giving my existence meaning, for allowing me to love and be loved even after death. You've made these 37 years the most fulfilling of my existence." As Eleanor moved toward the window, her form began to dissolve into points of light, like stars gathering for a celestial dance. The last thing they heard was her voice, carried on a breeze that shouldn't have existed in the closed room. "Remember, dear ones, that the greatest magic is love, and love never ends." Eleanor's luminous form drifted toward the open window, as points of golden light swirled around her like fireflies in the gathering dusk. The tower room, which had been filled with warmth and supernatural energy all day, now hummed with a different kind of power, the energy of transition and transformation. In the garden below, Eleanor's parents had drawn closer to the house, their own forms becoming more solid and radiant as their daughter prepared to join them. Thomas could see the profound love in their faces, mixed with patient understanding of the sacrifice Eleanor had made to protect her living family. "Look," Margaret whispered, pointing out the window. Other figures had begun to appear in the garden, translucent forms that seemed to emerge from the very air itself. Thomas recognized some faces from family portraits, ancestors who had passed on decades or even centuries ago, all gathering to witness Eleanor's long-awaited reunion with her parents. "They're all here," Eleanor said, her voice now carrying an otherworldly echo. "All the Whitmores who've gone before, come to welcome me home and to meet the family I've protected all these years." Dr. Whitmore approached the window, his medical skepticism completely transformed into wonder. "Eleanor, is there anything you need us to do? Any final arrangements?" Eleanor turned back to them one last time, her form now so ethereal that the lamplight passed through her like morning mist. "Keep this room as it is if you're willing. Not as a shrine to death, but as a reminder that love endures beyond physical existence. And when Margaret is older, when her gifts are fully developed, she may find it useful to have a place where the veil between worlds is thin." Margaret clutched the brass key Eleanor had given her, understanding instinctively that she was now the guardian of something precious and mysterious. "Eleanor, will you visit me in my dreams sometimes?" "Dreams are where the living and the dead can meet most easily," Eleanor replied with a gentle smile. "Yes, dear one, I'll visit you there, especially when you need guidance with your gifts." Thomas stepped forward, feeling compelled to offer something in return for all Eleanor had given them. "Eleanor, is there anything we can do for you? Any message you'd like us to carry forward?" Eleanor considered this, her glowing form pulsing softly as she chose her words carefully. "Tell future generations of our family that their gifts are not a burden or a curse, but a sacred responsibility. We are the bridge between worlds, the ones who help lost souls find their way home, the ones who comfort the grieving by proving that death is not an ending." She moved to the small music box on the windowsill and wound it one final time. As the familiar melody began to play, she added, "And remember that every time you hear this song, every time you see a child playing safely in this garden, every time this house shelters those you love, a part of me will be with you." The music box melody seemed to grow fuller, richer, as if an invisible orchestra had joined the simple mechanism. Through the window they could see the assembled spirits in the garden swaying gently to the music, a celestial dance of welcome and celebration. "It's time," Eleanor said, though her voice now seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She floated through the open window with the grace of a departing angel, her form trailing golden light that scattered on the evening breeze like stardust. As she descended toward her waiting parents, she grew more solid, more real, until she appeared as corporeal as any living person. The reunion in the garden was breathtaking to witness. Eleanor's mother opened her arms and gathered her daughter close, while her father's hand came to rest protectively on Eleanor's shoulder. For 37 years, they had waited for this moment, and now their family was complete again. Margaret pressed her face to the window glass, tears of both joy and sorrow streaming down her cheeks. "She looks so happy," she whispered. "She is," Thomas said, placing a comforting hand on his sister's shoulder. "She's where she belongs now." As the family of spirits prepared to depart for whatever realm awaited them, Eleanor looked up one final time at the tower room window. She raised her hand in a gesture that was part wave, part blessing, and her lips moved in words they couldn't hear, but somehow understood. "Thank you." Then, like morning mist touched by sunlight, the entire gathering of spirits began to fade. They didn't disappear abruptly, but dissolved gradually, becoming one with the evening air until only the empty garden remained, peaceful and serene under the first stars of night. The tower room fell silent, except for the gentle ticking of the music box as its melody wound down. But the silence wasn't empty or sad. It was filled with a profound sense of completion, of a sacred trust fulfilled, and a love story that had finally reached its perfect conclusion. "She's free," Dr. Whitmore said quietly, putting his arms around both his children. "After all these years, Eleanor is finally free." Margaret looked around the room that would now serve as a memorial to their family's supernatural heritage. The spiritual artifacts Eleanor had revealed still lay on the desk and windowsill, waiting to guide future generations of gifted Whitmores. "She's not really gone," Margaret said with the wisdom of a child touched by magic. "She's just gone home, but this will always be her room, and we'll always be her family." As they prepared to leave the tower room for the night, Thomas took one last look around, committing every detail to memory. Tomorrow, he would photograph this room thoroughly, creating a record of Eleanor's sanctuary for posterity. But tonight, they would simply let the profound peace of the space settle into their hearts, carrying with them the knowledge that love, once given freely, echoes through eternity. 3 months had passed since Eleanor's departure, and autumn had painted Salem in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The Whitmore house stood as magnificent as ever, but now it held an air of peaceful contentment rather than mysterious secrets. Thomas sat in his father's study, carefully mounting the final photographs in a leather-bound album he had titled The Eleanor Chronicles. The original photograph that had started their supernatural journey held the place of honor on the first page, followed by dozens of images he had taken of the tower room, the garden, and the spiritual artifacts Eleanor had left behind. Margaret had adapted to Eleanor's absence with remarkable resilience, though she often spoke of vivid dreams where she and Eleanor walked through gardens that sparkled with otherworldly light. Her supernatural gifts had grown stronger and more controlled under the guidance of Mrs. Catherine Whitfield, the Boston spiritualist Eleanor had recommended. "She's teaching me to help spirits who are lost find their way home," Margaret had explained to Thomas just that morning. "Eleanor was right, Tommy. Our gifts aren't meant just for us. They're meant to help others." Dr. Whitmore had embraced his family's supernatural heritage with the thoroughness of a dedicated scientist. He had begun corresponding with physicians in Boston and New York who were quietly studying psychic phenomena, contributing his observations about Margaret's abilities to what he hoped would become a more understanding approach to such gifts in the medical community. "Father," Thomas said as Dr. Whitmore entered the study, "I've been thinking about something Eleanor said, about our family being bridges between worlds." "What about it, son?" Thomas closed the photo album and turned to face his father. "I think we should document everything, not just for ourselves, but for future generations. Create a proper family history that includes both the ordinary events and the supernatural ones." Dr. Whitmore nodded approvingly. "I've been thinking the same thing. No more secrets, no more hiding from what we are." He moved to the window overlooking the garden, where Margaret was playing with her dolls beneath the oak tree. "Look at her, Thomas. She's never been happier or more confident." It was true. Margaret moved through the world now with a quiet assurance that came from understanding her place in it. She no longer feared the strange sensations that had once confused her, and she had even helped Mrs. Hartwell contact her deceased husband through the mirror in Eleanor's room. "The tower room has become quite popular," Thomas observed with a smile. "Mrs. Patterson asked yesterday if she might visit it to try to contact her mother. As long as Margaret is present to guide the sessions, I see no harm in it. Eleanor was right about our responsibility to help others. Dr. Whitmore picked up a letter from his desk. Speaking of which, we've received another inquiry from that journalist in Boston, the one writing about unexplained phenomena in New England. Thomas had been corresponding with several writers and researchers who had heard whispers of the Whitmore family's experiences. While they remained discreet about the details, they had begun sharing Eleanor's story with those who approached them with genuine scholarly interest. "I think Eleanor would approve," Thomas said. She wanted future generations to understand that supernatural gifts were meant to be embraced, not hidden. That evening, as was becoming their custom, the family gathered in the tower room for what Margaret called Eleanor's hour. They would light the oil lamp, wind the music box, and simply sit together in comfortable silence, feeling the lingering warmth of Eleanor's love that still seemed to permeate the space. Margaret often used these times to practice her developing abilities, gazing into the silver mirror and describing the spirits she could see moving through what she called the in-between place. Sometimes she delivered messages from departed loved ones to living relatives, always with the gentle wisdom that Eleanor had passed on to her. "There's someone here tonight," Margaret said softly. Her eyes focused on something the adults couldn't see. "A woman in a blue dress. She says her name is Catherine, and she's been looking for her son James for a very long time." Dr. Whitmore leaned forward with interest. "Can you help her find him? She says he's not dead. He's just far away, in California working in the gold mines. She wants him to know that she forgives him for leaving, and that she understands he had to follow his dreams." Margaret's voice took on the ethereal quality it always carried when she was serving as a conduit between worlds. "She says to tell him that the locket he left on her grave has been keeping her company, and when he's ready to come home, she'll be waiting." These sessions had become deeply meaningful for the entire family, connecting them not just to Eleanor's memory, but to the broader tapestry of human experience that stretched across the boundary between life and death. As the evening wound down and they prepared to leave the tower room, Margaret paused at the window overlooking the garden. "Eleanor visited my dreams again last night," she said quietly. "What did she tell you?" Thomas asked. "She said our family story is just beginning, that someday, maybe when I'm grown up, there will be other families like ours who need to understand their gifts. She said the tower room will help many people over the years, and that love always finds a way to guide those who need guidance." Dr. Whitmore extinguished the oil lamp, but the room seemed to retain a gentle glow as if lit by starlight from within. "Eleanor chose well when she decided to stay and protect us," he said, "and she chose well when she decided it was time to go. Both decisions were made from love." As they descended the narrow stairs from the tower room, Thomas reflected on how profoundly their lives had changed since that summer afternoon when he took a simple photograph of his sister on her swing. What had begun as a mystery had become a revelation, transforming not just their understanding of their family history, but their entire perception of life, death, and the enduring power of love. The photograph that had revealed Eleanor's presence now served as the cornerstone of a new chapter in the Whitmore family story, one where supernatural gifts were treasured rather than feared, where the boundary between worlds was acknowledged as permeable, and where love was understood to be the most powerful force in any realm. In the garden outside, the swing moved gently in the evening breeze, and if someone looked very carefully at just the right moment, they might catch a glimpse of golden light dancing around the oak tree, a reminder that some guardians never truly leave but simply transform their vigil into something eternal and beautiful.